Hello from New York. I'm Chris Hayes, here with Israeli journalist Noam Shazaf, Nora Erekat of the Badil Resource Center for Palestinian Refugee and Residency Rights, David Frum of Newsweek and the Daily Beast, and Youssef Munayyer of the Jerusalem Fund. We're talking about the conflict in Gaza. Youssef, you just talked about the context of what Gaza is, and Nora, David Frum said this thing that I think is a consensus view in Israel and in the U.S., consensus, I mean, broadly shared, that you cannot make peace with Hamas. And I'm curious what your thoughts are on that.
Well, first, just the obvious, that Hamas is on record for stating that it would enter into peace on the 1967 borders for a two-state solution, even if it wasn't permanent, that it was willing to enter into those negotiations. But more importantly, Israel has said that it has not had a partner for peace well before Hamas existed.
Right.
Hamas didn't come into existence until 1987. And before then, Israel didn't have a partner for peace. Before Hamas came into parliamentary power in 2006, Israel said that Mahmoud Abbas couldn't be its partner for peace and unilaterally withdrew from Gaza. And not until 2006 did Mahmoud Abbas of Fatah then become the partner that Israel can deal with, and Hamas is the problem. The problem is not that. It's whether or not Israel indeed wants a diplomatic solution, or whether it thinks that it could pummel Gaza, pummel Palestinians into subjugation without having to negotiate on settlements, on water distribution, on border rights, on the freedom of movement.
It does seem to me, I remember when I was in Israel and talking to, I was in Gush Etzion, and where actually a rocket just landed recently, and talking to someone who was in the Yeshua Council of Settlers, and he was basically saying, I said to him, well, this just seems kind of untenable. Like, is this the way it's going to be? Just this? And he said, yeah, that's fine. Basically, that this, it's not great, it's not ideal, but this is basically what it's going to be, as opposed to, I think, 5-10 years ago, earlier, particularly before the Second Intifada, but earlier in the Oslo process, there was an idea that this is all heading towards some endpoint, which is peace, which is the two-state solution. And now it seems to me like Israeli public opinion is, this is how it is.
Yeah, I think that Israeli leadership, at the great talent of Netanyahu, is recognizing the fact that the equilibrium point from Israeli perspective is the status quo. Now, obviously, Israelis are concerned about the rockets, and right now things are unbearable there. But ultimately, the status quo is the solution from the perspective of this government. And for the Palestinian, it's a perpetuate war. Right. The Palestinians have their war every day of the week. So in the long term, this is a process that plays against Israeli interests, but there is no incentive for the current political leadership to move from it, especially with the free hand it gets from the world and from the United States.
Yeah, I mean, I would say to anyone watching, if you put aside the question of who is responsible for the current state of affairs, and you said to yourself, from behind a veil of ignorance, you get to be beamed down into being a citizen of Gaza or a citizen of, say, Tel Aviv, I think anyone would. What the status quo means for the two peoples in terms of what their day-to-day lives are look very different. I think there's no denying that, David.
But we were talking about how you said a very wise thing earlier on about how Americans only become aware of this intermittently in spasms of violence. If you take a longer view, the defining effect for everyone on the Israeli side, and even more for the diaspora Jewish community, is the disappointment of the Oslo process. Especially for the diaspora Jewish community in the United States and other places. The Oslo process was really believed in, and I'm an active member of the community. We believed it, and the Israeli politicians who were most popular outside Israel were those who spoke for people like Shimon Peres, people like Benjamin Netanyahu who were mistrusted, and that what happened with the Second Intifada, and this is the price we are all living in the aftermath of that war, was the collapse of liberal opinion, both in Israel and even more in the diaspora. Nobody believes in it anymore. The reason people think that this conflict can only be managed was because of those 2 terrible years in which 1,000 Israelis were killed by terrorism. And what just about everybody, and the reason why Benjamin Netanyahu has emerged as such a consensus leader within Israel, and even more amazingly in the external Jewish world, is because of the belief, you know what?
Right.
The liberals were wrong. It just didn't work.
Look, on this point, there's no doubt that violence is happening with complete asymmetry, with a much more dominant Israeli military power over a civilian Palestinian population, largely civilian Palestinian population. That does happen. And it happens on both sides. Only one side, though, which is the Israeli side, has the capacity to physically change the map on the ground through extensive colonization of Palestinian territory. And when we're talking about the Oslo process, which was, the objective of which was to have a Palestinian state emerge on 22% of historic Palestine, that is the thing that is torpedoing that objective. There is less and less and less of Palestine to talk about.
I mean, just because people who are tuning into this debate, right? This is the way the argument tends to go, right? Which is that when you talk about the current status quo, the people will say, particularly on the Israeli side or the American diaspora side, the thing that's driving the impossibility of peace is the trauma of the Second Intifada and the belief that there is no negotiating partner on the other side. And people on the Palestinian side will tend to say, what is driving the impossibility of peace is the continued settlement activity of an Israeli government, which is showing its hand, as someone said to me once in the West Bank, negotiating over the pizza while eating the pizza. Nora.
Well, I actually had a question for David, because it's precisely about the starting point that the Second Intifada is what shattered this faith amongst liberal Jewish community that there could be a negotiated settlement. But what about the interim years between 1993 and 2000, when under the leadership of Ehud Barak at the time, settlements doubled? This was during the heyday of when we were supposed to believe in the two-state solution. So I wonder, does that factor into the liberal Jewish community's, constellation of factors of what actually torpedoed the peace process?
Well, I think that certainly what American Jews would think, and the American Jewish community being more liberal than the Israeli Jewish community on balance, was you were driving toward a goal. And because the settlements are just about money, in the end, it's just buildings.
But on Palestinian lands.
But they're the future of Palestinian. They're the Palestinian apartment blocks of the future, potentially. That's the way we would have thought about this in the 1990s.
But on destroyed lands.
But apartments are useful things, and the thinking was then that there would be a deal, and probably these buildings would all be turned over, and the settlers would be evacuated, as they were evacuated from Gaza, 8,000 of them. That was the hope, and that is the hope that is gone. And when you talk to probably the people listening to the show, that feeling of absent hope. And one of the things that this process has to include is a restoration of the hope that there really is more than just management ahead.
No, please.
Yes, the problem is that by creating those settlements, and right now every fifth person in the West Bank is a Jewish settler, you raise the political price of any move from the status quo for the Israeli leadership. So right now, even if this prime minister or the next prime minister will want to go to an agreement, the internal pressure against it will be enormous. So Israel is actually feeding the trends that put the long-term survival of the state at risk.
And let me say this, as someone who's not a pacifist, but close to, and basically loathes violence, and when I read about Hamas executing someone on the streets for being a collaborator, it sends chills down my spine. And when I read about dead 11-month-old, I have a 1-year-old child, a dead 11-month-old child of a stringer from the BBC in Gaza from an airstrike, it's devastating. That the thing that bothers me about this, or the thing that makes me really upset, is that it doesn't seem like anyone is creating incentives for action other than violence. Right, and this is particularly true about the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank, which is that there have been nonviolent resistance in the West Bank. There's been hunger strikes. There's been mass marches that have been peaceful, and essentially the American media pays no attention, does nothing. And whatever you say, you think their claims are bad or not, it seems to me the first thing is to get the conflict on nonviolent footing before there is any resolution of it, because violence is going to untangle it, and there are no incentives right now for nonviolence. So I want to think about what are the next steps to get to nonviolence after this break. Left off the conversation talking about, I guess, a path forward that isn't increasing bloodshed and violence, and there's some talk about whether there's going to be a ground invasion, and I think the political consequences of the last ground invasion were not fantastic from the perspective of Israeli politics. And there's worries about what the strategic end of such a ground invasion will be, so hopefully that won't happen, I think. What is the next step, I guess, of getting to a ceasefire? There's now talk about involving Mohammed Morsi and the Egyptian Brotherhood in Egypt as a way of negotiating a ceasefire. And then if there is a cessation to the explicit violence at this moment, then what next?
Well, I'm going to defer on ceasefire is inevitable. It will happen. But let me just mention something about the first operation of this sort in 2008, 2009 during Operation Cast Lead, when Israel also thought that it could just pummel Palestinians into subjugation. I was part of a legal fact-finding mission in February 2009 in the direct aftermath and did interviews with families in Gaza. And in one part of Gaza City, a Zaytun neighborhood, I met with members of the Samuni family. The Samuni family was rounded up and placed into a single home. 110 of them were in a single home, and then an aerial missile struck upon it. And the Goldstone report commented on this. There were dozens of people killed, and the Red Cross wasn't able to remove the body for 17 days afterwards. This was reported in the Goldstone report. I was personally involved in lobbying campaigns in Congress to exert some sort of accountability on Israel. Israel refused any sort of external accountability, conducted its own investigation, and said that it was a mistake because there were a weapons storage nearby. And so this is to say that in order to move to the next step, there must be some sort of accountability for Israeli aggression and war crimes in order to rein in. It cannot have a blank check.
But what does that mean? What does that mean? I mean,
listen, I'll help you understand what that means. When we take there's going to be a ceasefire, and then what's going to happen, as we've done in the past, is forget about the issue. That's the problem. We cannot ignore the issue when Palestinian fishermen are being shot by the Israeli naval blockade. We cannot ignore the issue when 12-year-olds are being shot on their side of the border. We cannot ignore the issue when nonviolent demonstrators are being repressed. If we say to the Palestinians, we will not condemn Israeli repression of nonviolent dissent, and we will not condemn Israeli repression of violent dissent, then what we are saying to the Palestinians is, you will take your occupation and your oppression, and you will like it and say nothing about it. That's the problem. The message that we're sending to Palestinians from Washington is that you're the only nation that does not have a right to self-defense, and no nation is going to accept that.
The message that is being sent to the Palestinians is you started a war in 2000, and you lost it in 2002, and now you have to seek peace on the basis of having lost that war. And that one of the things when you speak of incentives, that if you say to nations, start wars, and if you win, you win. And if you lose, you have no downside consequence because you get to go back to the very first page you were on when you started the war. Then war becomes, especially if the society is non-democratic and they don't have to consult the people who pay the price, war becomes a perpetual temptation. And what is happening, what the Palestinians are living with now are the consequences of the defeat of 2002. And the wall is part of the defeat. Now, that is not to say that everything the Israelis do is wise. It is probably not wise to build new settlements over and beyond the wall. I mean, it creates all kinds of strategic problems. But we are living in a post-war environment. And as to your dislike of violence, in fact, what is happening is that these conflicts are progressively becoming less violent and more symbolic. And that is very true of this conflict as compared to Cast Lead. That it is the internet that is becoming the battlefield, the TV camera that is becoming the battlefield, Twitter that is becoming the battlefield.
There's actual real
people in the south, not in Gaza and in Israel. In the south, it's a very real battlefield. I've spoken to my family, and there was a siren alarm in Tel Aviv. There are siren alarms all the morning in Gaza. And what I would like to see is an international involvement after the ceasefire is reached, because I think we actually send the Palestinians the opposite message of what you're saying, David, because what happened, look in a holistic approach. After the first Intifada, we were willing to go to Oslo. After the second Intifada, we gave the disengagement. We pulled out. Basically, the Palestinians have only gotten something through violence. Even the only thing is that it had to be a greater violence than we could have imagined in order to achieve something like there was in the second Intifada. And what are the long-term consequences for Israelis and Palestinians? And I totally agree that there is an international indifference to the conflict when it's not contained or managed. And in Israel, in this part, I do agree with you, there is a comfort zone around containing the conflict. And we've got to move away from this comfort zone, as difficult politically as it is. So I would like to see American involvement. I would like to see international involvement. I would like to see Jewish community involvement.
And here's the thing that I would say is that what I would like to see as an American citizen is the American government and American institutions, again, move the conflict to nonviolent footing. Which is to say, support those people in Palestine, and there are many, who are struggling for their interests in a nonviolent fashion as opposed to ignoring them or as opposed to just worrying about the conflict when there is violence, because that, to me, seems part of perpetuating the problem. I want to thank Israeli journalist Noam Shazaf, Nora Erekat of the Badil Resource Center for Palestinian Refugee and Residency Rights, Youssef Manayer of the Jerusalem Fund for joining us this morning. Thanks. It was a great conversation. The strike threatening Walmart for the first time in years on Black Friday. That's next. This Friday is Black Friday, a shopping phenomenon that seems to get bigger every year. For Walmart, one of the big box retailers who helped create Black Friday as we know it, it's a BFD. Sales on Black Friday can account for over 40% of retailers' annual sales. 40%. For Walmart to make its earnings, Black Friday needs to go smoothly, and that's why a strike planned by Walmart retail and warehouse workers for Black Friday is potentially so important. In the past, threats from workers and organizations to the retail behemoth have been largely empty. Labor organizations have tried to hold Walmart accountable for its labor practices for years, but with little success. Over the past several months, something has changed. Workers fighting for better conditions and an end to company retaliation against workers who speak up have successfully pulled off work stoppages around the country. Retail workers have walked out of 28 Walmarts in 12 states. So have workers in warehouses subcontracted by Walmart everywhere from California to Indiana. These actions are truly unprecedented and have raised the stakes for Black Friday. In a statement to MSNBC, Walmart dismissed the strike's importance, saying, quote, "This is just another exaggerated publicity campaign aimed at generating headlines to mislead our customers and associates." But they appear to be taking the planned Black Friday strike very, very seriously. In mid-October, Walmart Vice President Tom Mars held a very rare meeting with 3 warehouse workers from Illinois and California. And on Friday, Walmart asked the NLRB, the National Labor Relations Board, for an injunction against United Food and Commercial Workers, the group they cite as responsible for the actions, in an unfair labor practice charge. It's the company's first legal action in months of unrest, and evidence the strike plan for Black Friday is seen as a real threat by a company that has for decades been impervious to labor's attempts to hold them accountable. Joining us now is Greg Fletcher, a Walmart associate in Duarte, California, Heather McGee, vice president of the progressive think tank Demos, and Raymond Castillo, a member of Warehouse Workers United, who works in a Mira Loma, California warehouse that's a Walmart distribution center. Walmart told us they had no one available to join our conversation today. Greg and Raymond, it's great to have you here. Raymond, maybe I'll start with you. Can you just tell me about the work you do? You're working in a warehouse. What does that look like? What is the actual work you do? How much money do you make?
Okay. Thank you for having me on the show. And the warehouse that I work at is in Mira Loma. And the work we do is, it's hard work, but it's doable work. And the conditions is like the equipment is broken and the ramps are broken, which is very dangerous, as well as not having water. And I mean, we used to pay for our gloves and our masks and, safety goggles, all our equipment. And for the work we do, like, we lift heavy boxes and we from trailer to trailer, and the weather out there, it goes up to like 120 degrees.
So it's 120 degrees. There's a trailer that gets pulled into the warehouse center, and you guys, and there's a temperature, there's 102 on that thermometer. There's stuff in the trailer, and you guys go in and bring. I mean, that's the work, right? You go in and you carry it out.
Yeah, we put it on a cart, and we pull the cart, and the carts are normally broken, like misassembled and all that. And we pull the carts out, and then like another guy comes and takes the carts and loads it in the trailer.
And how much money do you make, and who are you working for directly?
Oh, I make $8 an hour, and we work for WearStaff, which is a company, an agency that NFI hired, which is Walmart hired NFI.
So Walmart hires a company that runs a warehouse. That company then subcontracts out to a temp agency, and they're the ones that hire you.
Yes.
Why did you get involved with? I mean, what are your complaints? What do you want to see change in your workplace?
What I want to see change in my workplace is better opportunities to move up. Of course, a living wage, because I have to work 2 jobs, and to support my family, just to support and have a good, decent, life. And safety. Like, I go to work and I don't know if I'm going to go home.
Greg, you're an associate in a store,
I am.
and there's a lot more of those. There are about 1.6 million workers in stores, I think. And I'm curious what your experience of working at Walmart's been like.
Well, my experience with the company is that, Walmart has this motto. It's on their commercials: save money, live better. And what we find in the stores, in my store, and throughout the country, is that they don't really live up to that as far as how it reflects in the way that they treat their workers. A great example is the holiday, Thanksgiving. For the majority of the company's existence, we had that day.
Because we live in America and we work for the world's largest company and we're still not making it.
Because I have to choose between paying my bills and having enough to eat.
Because I'm 52 years old and I can't afford my own apartment on what I make at Walmart.
Because my management disrespects me in front of customers.
Because my fellow associates have to use our local food pantries.
Because I am tired being discriminated by management.
Because we have to depend on each other check by check and borrow money from each other just to make it to the next week.
Because I spoke out in my store and Walmart illegally fired me for it.
Those are some workers from our Walmart. I should state that Walmart says categorically that they do not fire people as retaliation, just so that's on the record. That would be illegal under National Labor Relations Act. Heather, the context for this, to broaden this out, is that we have one of the largest employers and a kind of setting a benchmark for both labor practices, but also logistics, distribution practices, marketing practices, pricing. And I guess people will say, look, yeah, it sounds like it's not a lot of fun being a Walmart associate, but that's low-wage work, and Walmart guarantees their customers lower prices, and so, sorry, this is the way the market works.
Yeah, we at Demos wanted to actually dig into this question, right? Because if we've seen a shift, a historic shift from GM being our largest employer and an employer that basically helped create the middle class in this country, to Walmart, right? To a low-wage employer being the great American job. Is it necessary to actually have low wages in order to have low prices, right? That's the question. Everybody says, that's the trade-off. So we dug into it, and we looked not just at Walmart, but actually all of the biggest chain stores. And we asked the question, okay, if those big chain stores were to raise the wage floor so that the lowest paid worker made essentially $12.25 an hour or $25,000 a year for full-time employment, right, which would be about a 27% raise from that typical retail worker now. What would that do? And we found, the report's being released tomorrow, we found that it would lift 700,000 people and their families out of poverty. It would give about 5.3 million workers a raise. And it would create about 100,000 jobs because you're putting money in the hands of people who are going to spend it.
It would be essentially stimulus.
It would be a private sector, retail-led stimulus. Then, okay,
what
that's great. That's right. That's all like apple pie, flat screen. Exactly. But you want your Black Friday flat screen. So the question was, how much would this cost? So the whole large chain store sector, right, would cost about $20 billion to do this kind of a wage floor. How does that compare? One, it's actually less than just the top 10 largest retailers spent buying back their own shares in the market last year, which is something that they do to sort of boost the earnings per share, but it doesn't have any real productivity improvements. It's good for executive comp. And then when it comes to consumers, right, it would be at most, on average, 15 cents per shopping trip if they pass the entire cost of that wage increase on to consumers. So 15 cents, less than a quarter. Can the American people afford a private sector stimulus that's going to lift the wages of 5 million people? I think they can.
So how are you going to achieve this? You're not going to achieve it when labor markets are slack. And one of the
Why not?
Because labor, like everything else, has its price set in marketplaces, and when you have very high unemployment and when you have very slack labor markets, and we've had very slack labor markets for a long time.
But that's just market theory. Obviously, we're going to achieve this by the retailers themselves paying their workers.
But the retailers
more.
compete with other retailers, and people who are now small retailers who don't do it will become big retailers. I mean, the question that viewers have to consider, that people take that people are thinking about this as a policy have to say is, if you want higher wages, if you want the wages you had in big manufacturing companies in the 50s, you have to have what we had then, which were tight labor markets. And that was partly because of demographics, few children being born in the 1930s. It was also because of restrictive immigration laws. That what we've done, we've had essentially open immigration since the early 1970s. We've had a huge sort of follow-on baby boom, and we have now very, very slack markets. We have educational standards that haven't risen over time.
I don't understand how. I mean, we've shown that the companies can afford it. That we're not talking about going back to a $50,000 a year, you get a full pension job. We're talking about a minimum raise to $25,000 a year, and we've shown that the companies can afford it. So when you put it on market forces,
but companies they can afford a lot of things. Why should they do it?
Why? Because it would be a benefit. Actually, the other part that I didn't say, it would be a benefit to retailers as well, right? About $5 billion would go back to the retail sector. Right. Walmart customers themselves would have more money.
But they're only going to do it.
They're
only going to do. I mean, let me just insert myself into this discussion, which is that it's not just noblesse oblige by the Walton family on one side, or the slackness or tightness of labor markets. It's about worker power also, right? That actually we have
workers have power when labor markets are tight.
Workers have power when labor markets are tight. Workers also have power as guaranteed statutorily by the United States federal government and laws that we passed that we completely ignore, right? I mean, that's also the part of it, is that you have absolutely the right to engage in concerted activity like you gentlemen are doing and not be retaliated upon.
Well, I'd like to add that that's kind of where we fit into the mix of that, is that, I mean, all of that makes sense if the workers are passive and completely accept what's being handed to them. But and that's why, standing up and living better, the motto of our group, is so important, because we're saying, look, we're people. I have my children ask me, why aren't you here? Right. We'd like to go to Knott's Berry Farm. We'd like to do these fun things, but we can't. Sometimes we can't afford even to rent a movie.
Right. I want to talk to you also about the importance of wages on one hand, and then just some autonomy or say in your workplace, particularly in the warehouse setting. Right after we take this break. Here's David. You talked about what are the dynamics that are going to raise both the wages and conditions for workers in both Walmart and retail more broadly. And I thought this was an interesting. A little catch here. William Poole, he was then chief executive of the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis, and he's talking after there's some labor activity that happened in 2006, largely spearheaded by the UFCW. He said, my Walmart contact, he's telling people what his Walmart contact told him, also said Walmart is in the process of raising starting wages in about 700 stores. This is the first time in 8 years of talking with him that I've heard any comment like that. He said some of the raises are part of the Walmart, I'll call it social political agenda because of all the controversy around Walmart, which, suggests that actually this does have an effect. And you were in Bentonville, Arkansas, right?
Yes.
In a meeting with someone from Walmart. Tell me about that meeting.
He spoke a lot, and what he had to say, really wasn't, was like the history of it. But I mean, we all do kind of know about the history of Walmart and how it got started. But how he acted when I told him how the conditions were, he acted like he didn't know anything about it. Mm-hmm. This is the first time I'm hearing of it. And in one sense, it is, it was believable that he was telling the truth. But in the second sense, it's like he knew about it, and he's not really doing anything.
Have conditions changed at all since the meeting in Bentonville?
Yes, the conditions have. Mm-hmm. But it's basically...
How specifically?
We didn't have water, fresh water, at all throughout the warehouse, and now we do. We were drinking from dirty water, hose water. Sometimes we didn't even have water, and we do now. But it's still there's still empty water containers and all that around the warehouse. Like they don't refill them, quite fast enough because we all drink water when we're working, sweating and all that. But that's just state law though, So he was basically the bar set this standard, and they were below. So he kind of just set the standard bar, you know what I'm saying? Like, as, what it's supposed to be.
Chris, notice the date on that quote you just read, 2006.
Right.
That was at the peak of the 2000 and post-2003 economic expansion. If we had an expanding economy, if we had tighter markets, it's
but David,
not just about politics.
David, you've written about this. We have seen in the sort of post-70s era periods of full employment that still have had terrible distributional effects. I mean, you've written a lot about this to your credit. So there's something going on other than just full employment.
And I'll just say, I mean, so, we all know what's going on in the economy overall, and we sort of assume that means that retailers are suffering. The large retailers had their most profitable quarter in 10 years. This past year. So the profits are actually booming, and the reason why is that particularly they've squeezed workers. I mean, you can talk about this as well, but people are working more shifts. They've sort of squeezed compensation. Average compensation in the sector has gone down. So this is the question: if the workers of these companies have been able to help their companies rebound in a terrible economy, why is it that they can't gain a little bit of the reward for the work?
Exactly. I mean, one point that I always bring up is that, if our workers in our store had an additional, $200, $300, the first thing we do is, we'd buy our son an Xbox.
Right.
We'd
spend it at Walmart.
Precisely. So they would actually get all of it back, and I mean that should be helpful, I would imagine.
Yeah, please.
I was just going to say, and we did see that across the sector when we did the calculations, that it would essentially bring about $5 billion back in retail sales the following year. I mean, the thing is, low-wage workers are job creators, right? Low-wage workers are the people who are going to be spending 100% of their income, not able to save any. I mean, this is an unfortunate thing. It links back to the show yesterday about debt.
Right.
But if we are looking for, in a slack economy, if we are looking for what is going to be the strongest multiplier effect, money back in the pockets of working people is great.
Workers.
We're not going to see a lot of action from Washington on that, right? That was the theory of the stimulus, and we're not going to see it from the public sector. Let's see it from the private sector.
Do you get the earned income tax credit?
I do.
And is that important to you?
Yes. Yes, it is. Although it's the kind of thing where if I made enough to not receive it, that'd be okay too.
That's very well said. I want to hear about where your fellow workers are, because I mean, obviously, I think you guys are not representative in the sense that you're willing to come on television and talk about this, and you're very active. So I want to hear sort of where the other people that you work with are on this right after we take this break. There's the Warehouse Workers United to conduct a survey of working conditions, and they found 63% of warehouse workers injured on the job, 83% have suffered from job-related illness, 84% have witnessed an injury to a coworker. So my question to you is, what is the sentiment like of the folks that you work with? Do they sort of think, look, this is the job, this is what I signed up for? Do they think this is completely unfair? Are they somewhere in between? Like, is there a constituency that's going to be mobilized around this, or is there too much churn in who's working in the warehouse to make that happen?
Well, that's the thing about us. Like, we don't know if we're going to work tomorrow. We don't know if we're ever going to go back to work at this warehouse. And like with that is it's unsafe, and there are a lot of employees getting hurt, but they can replace them. And that's what they normally do. Someone gets hurt, they fire them, and I mean that's basically what they do.
You are working for a temp agency, and you don't have a set schedule, and you're not a full-time employee there. You're basically just, they say, we need you today, we need you tomorrow, and then you go and work.
Yes.
You have a different relationship. Your paycheck actually comes from Walmart.
Right.
You're inside the store. It's not these layers of subcontractors like Raymond has. Same question to you about where associates' feelings about this is, look, I like working here, or this is the job, or this is what I signed up for.
They all like the job. They all enjoy it. But, part of what got me into the organization was I've seen too many grown people crying, breaking down because of the stress, the abuse, so many people are just talked down to. Very few people have an argument as far as the validity of what we're doing. Of course, everyone's reaction is, aren't you afraid of being fired? Aren't you scared? I mean, they're terrified. Walmart's, they have their ways. Like you're saying, it's illegal for them to fire you for doing this, but they'll find something, and everyone always tells me they'll find something on you, but I mean, but then at the same time, they say someone has had to have done this for a long time. Someone needed to step up, and we're really doing that, and they love it.
Yeah, please.
I was just going to say, one of the key things I think for us to remember here is that there are retail employers who take a higher road, right? It is possible to still be profitable. In fact, there's a lot of research that shows that better treatment of your workers makes for a better store experience. Walmart knows this. They know that they have customer satisfaction issues, right? And so Costco, Safeway are great examples of employers that actually do the right thing, pay a decent wage for decent work, and are still in the black.
Please.
Yeah, if I can give a great example, because I work in the electronics and photo department, so I work in the high-end, high merchandise area, and we're understaffed. I've seen numerous times when someone's come in wanting to buy a $2,000, large big screen TV, and they walk away because no one's there to help them. I mean, half the department, because of the value of the merchandise, is under lock and key. So there has to be someone there to unlock it, and there isn't.
And one of the things I think that's really interesting here is that these labor actions seem to have caught some fire or doing more than previous ones. And I wonder what you think the reason for that is. I mean, what has changed, essentially?
For me, I think a lot of it's because, people have known for a long time how Walmart is. The customers come in and they've even commented, I notice people don't smile. I notice, you guys look stressed out. And I think that we've all known for a long time that this is what it is. So, again, it's like my coworkers. They're so glad to see that someone has finally brought out into the open the truth of things.
How much for you is this about wages, and how much of it is this sort of more basic kind of self-determination or dignity or some kind of control or over what your working environment looks like?
Yeah, well, most of it is about that. Like for me going home, I mean, yeah, it's the wages because it is tough out there, but I mean, I have a son, and I want to be able to play football with him, when he gets a little older, and. Like with that, we're not alone though. We're not the only warehouse. Yeah. And there's a lot of warehouses out there for Walmart that move none but Walmart merchandise, and the same thing that's happening in our warehouse is the same as theirs.
Yeah, people that shop at Walmart or have experience in the stores, that essentially the stores are the kind of tip of this massive iceberg of this unbelievable global supply chain that is a kind of amazing thing that happens, and it happens because there's a lot of workers along the way. And Heather, just one point to you is that there's actually, within Walmart, there's a comparison of sort of high road labor, which is the private Walmart truckers, who Walmart owns the biggest fleet in America, and they decided very early on, I think partly because they didn't want the Teamsters to come in, to pay their truckers very well. They have a lot of autonomy over their hours. It's actually some of the highest compensated truck drivers in the whole country, right? And they've decided that's a place to invest, and it's actually brought some productivity gains.
I think that goes to show the power that, working people banding together has, not just in unionized workforces, but to put pressure on companies that don't have unions, that resist unions fiercely, the way that Walmart does. Unfortunately, the retail sector is highly under-unionized for the type of work it is. It is the ideal sector to have the stability, the lack of turnover, all of those things that would actually have improvements for the retail sector itself.
Greg, thank you so much for coming in. Raymond, thank you. I want to thank my guest today, Walmart associate Greg Fletcher, Heather McGhee, who's doing a double duty this weekend. Thank you for yesterday and today from the progressive think tank Demos. David, it was great to have you at the table. David Frum, author of the new book, Why Romney Lost, and Raymond Castillo from Warehouse Workers United.